Ukraine, there's been a lot happening on the battlefield there. So let's go ahead and put this up there with this on the screen. Actually, Ukraine losing its final eastern stronghold in the Luhansk regions. We haven't been talking as much about Luhansk here on the show, but part of the reason why it matters is that of course, is one of the breakaway republics that began this entire thing. We'll remember that Putin recognized Luhansk and the Donetsk, so-called People's Republics, and that was part of the pretext for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Restoring and keeping the so-called territorial integrity of these breakaway regions, which have kind of been in civil war in Ukraine now for almost 8 or 9 years. Well, now you have Ukrainian troops actually withdrawing from the most major city in that last place where they had an urban holdout. And that just faces another battlefield withdrawal by the Ukrainian military in the eastern part of the country, which really has been the flashpoint on this for a long time. And it represents both a victory in terms of not just Russia in the battlefield, but an affirmation of their new tactics. And by new, I really mean old. They have reverted to their old supply chain, using railway cars. They are just bombarding the hell out of these cities with artillery, indiscriminately killing whomever they want and whatever they need, leveling and willing to wage total warfare against the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainian military is largely conscripts, not as experienced. A lot of their experienced guys have either been killed or wounded at this point. They have a tremendous rate of attrition that is happening there on the ground. They have some conscripts that they can call up, but we're talking about only 6-7 weeks or so of basic training. To the extent they have advanced weaponry, they barely know how to use it. A lot of it, they have to be trained by the US and by NATO allies, so that hasn't been employed on the battlefield. And just slowly, we are watching what happens when you have a lesser power meet a great power in warfare. Yes, Russians embarrassed themselves in the initial movements on Kyiv and in their initial battlefield tactics, but they are still a great power military with a ton of Soviet power, leftover military equipment, and they have tens of millions of conscripts that they can draw upon if they need to. So their new strategy is working, and also they have the industrial base in order to keep up the artillery bombardment against Ukraine, which Ukraine, of course, does not have given the fact that their economy is contracting, and they've already lost, a significant part of their territory. At the same time, polling for the president and for the administration, the U.S. handling of this, is not even close to where the Biden administration started out from. So the Concerned Veterans of America commissioned a very interesting poll. Let's put this up there on the screen. Americans remain very weary of more intervention in Ukraine. But the most, interesting part to me was that 44% currently have an unfavorable opinion of Biden's handling of the war. 1/3 only have a favorable opinion. So the rest are basically not really clear on what's happening. A quarter of the American public, only a quarter supports directly involving. So another way of saying 3/4 of the American public doesn't want any direct U.S. military involvement in Russia. Twice as many people who oppose that. And when you compare this, and this is the most key, to a similar poll conducted in February, American sentiment on going to war with Russia has remained unchanged, roughly half oppose and less than a quarter supported. So you can see, though, that the hawkish attitudes do remain in a quarter or so of the public, but the sliding scale of the approval of the Biden administration and their handling of the war is continuing to go down, and only 1/3 of the country affirmatively supporting that, given what we see with gas prices and more. And also, look, we just have to acknowledge this. Ukraine is losing in the current iteration of this war. They have not lost. They are certainly not out of the game, but they are losing the current iteration of what we see there on the battlefield. And absent direct U.S. military involvement or arming them with some outrageous weapons, which would almost certainly provoke some sort of confrontation with Russia, this is most likely to be the status quo. But as we covered in our last show, some 90% of Ukrainians left in the country, to be clear, left in the country, do not want to cede even one iota of territory. So the hawkish attitudes amongst the Ukrainian public probably even more so than the Russian public in terms of the people who support this. No real incentive from the administration, from NATO, in terms of getting Zelensky to negotiate. So he really is in a rock and a hard place. He's got no domestic support to negotiate. He's got no international support to negotiate. And of course, the Russians could end this tomorrow too if they wanted to, but they're not going to. They're all in at this point, and there's no indication that they may even stop once they win these eastern parts of the country.
I'm reminded of the way that our mission in Afghanistan changed without ever having any real public discussion or debate about what we were doing in the country. And I feel like we see the very same thing happening in Ukraine, where, you have officials who haven't really been straight with the public about what exactly we're doing there, about how exactly things are going on the ground. We've also had reporting that the Ukrainians aren't even really keeping us apprised, our top officials apprised of how things are going on the ground as well. And so now would be a phenomenal time to take a step back, assess the landscape accurately, and decide what it is we actually want and what we're going to do to achieve it. Instead, I think we're going to just sort of continue sleepwalking in the same direction, keeping the public in the dark, making extraordinary, expenditures, and continuing the escalation in terms of our actions and our intelligence providing and what we're giving them in terms of military aid. I think we'll just continue in that same direction and really not ever take a step back to say, what are we doing and what does an end game look like? And that is an extremely dangerous game. And so I think the public senses that. I think that's why you see the support trailing off for Biden's policy here, because people are starting to go, all right, when does this end? How do we get to some kind of a peace here? We were kind of told Ukraine was going to win and that was going to be that. It doesn't look like we're heading in that direction. So what now?
Yeah, that's right. And look, I mean, to be honest, even though Afghanistan cost us, I think, $700 billion at the end, in Iraq, $2 trillion, the gas was never $5 a gallon as a result of those invasions. So in a way, this invasion and the cost to the American people is probably higher, even though we did end up paying for that in other ways through deficit spending. The immediate pain felt at the pocketbook, at the pump, and elsewhere is much higher on this conflict. And to the Afghan point, I'm going to talk about this in my monologue, but let's put this Washington Post piece up there on the screen about how, as the Ukraine war bogs down, U.S. assessments face scrutiny. Well, guess what, Krystal? The Pentagon is no longer telling us how things are going for the Ukrainians. They're not giving us assessments on how the Ukrainian military is faring. Now, the Pentagon's excuse is, well, we're not going to do the Russians' battle damage assessments for them. Well, I remember covering the Afghan war and hearing the exact same thing. We're not going to tell the Taliban how the Afghan National Security Forces are doing. Well, how did that work out for us during the fall of Kabul? The American people had no idea how their taxpayer dollars were being used to support a foreign military, whether that foreign military was, capable of doing its job at all. At least to this point, the Ukrainian military is much more capable, less corrupt-ish than what we saw in Afghanistan, which is great. And, obviously I support their cause. However, we have no transparency, and we are sleepwalking it with Biden's as long as it takes attitude, the CIA, special operations people that we've talked about, which are openly acknowledged on the ground. And we have no off-ramp, period, in terms of getting away from the global disruption that has been wrought upon us. So I think Afghanistan very much is a good example of just how long these things can go, how, the Pentagon can go, even if 3/4 of the American public don't support it. What did we all learn in Iraq and Afghanistan? They can go on forever. They can invent every policy and, fake rhetoric known to man in order to convince you that what's going on over there is supposedly to your interest. And that is not safe for the world when the stakes are this high.
I think there's another important piece here, which is it's important to remember what the status quo was before Russia, fully invades and launches this war, which is that they held Crimea and they effectively held some areas in Luhansk and Donetsk in the eastern part of the state. So what is our goal in conjunction with our Ukrainian allies? Is it to push the Russians back to where they were? Right. Is it to push them out of even those territories that they had held, go beyond where the status quo was before? These are basic questions with extraordinarily significant repercussions that we have absolutely no clarity on whatsoever. The fact that we are so deeply engaged in this, and it really truly is a proxy war. The fact that we are so deeply engaged in this and the American people don't have basic answers to these questions is really unconscionable and inexcusable. And I do blame the media also for their complete failure to push administration officials on any of these questions or to adequately explain to the American public what the costs and consequences and risks and trade-offs are here. I thought Congressman Khanna had a good quote in that Washington Post article He says, look, he applauds the administration's objective in stopping Russia from seizing Kyiv, but the United States cannot resign itself to a, quote, prolonged, never-ending conflict that is wreaking havoc on the American economy and global economy. He says, I believe we should declare victory for the president's efforts in standing up for a sovereign Ukraine. We should say we won, the Russians lost. They did not achieve their fundamental objective, that maximalist initial objective. People do not want to see a resigned attitude that this is just going to go on as long as it's going to go on. What is the plan on the diplomatic front? And, a really basic question that we have zero answers to.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, he's 1 out of 435, and the 434 are not singing the same tune. So as long as that remains the case, we'll be talking about it here on this show, and people will continue to be poorer, and a lot of people are going to continue to die. And I hate to put it that way, but I think the stakes are high enough and that people should understand it at home.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.